The road that doesn't exist. I often take the same route to work. It's a straight, boring drive through a small town in Ohio. Yesterday I left a bit later than usual, so I decided to take a shortcut down an old country road I'd never noticed before. The pavement was a bit cracked, but otherwise looked fine. No signs or street names, just an empty, straight road. After driving for about 3 miles, I realized I should have already hit the main highway, but there was nothing around me, just woods and an old telephone line running alongside the road. I tried to turn around, but couldn't. The road felt endless. My phone had no signal. After a while, I saw an old abandoned gas station. Standing beside it was a man in a blue jumpsuit. I decided to ask for directions. I pulled up closer and shouted, "Hey, excuse me, how do I get to the main road?" The man slowly turned, and I froze. His face was blurry, like pixels were disappearing and reappearing. He didn't say a word, just raised his hand and pointed forward. I slammed the gas and drove on. A few minutes later, I passed the same gas station again. The same man was standing in the exact same spot. I screamed at myself, panic tightening around me. I started jerking the steering wheel, trying to drive off the road, but neither the woods nor the grass gave way. They looked real, but they felt flat, like stage props. Eventually, I turned off the engine and just sat there. Minutes passed before I heard knocking on my window. The man was standing right next to my car. He didn't speak, just stared. His eyes were like black holes. I don't remember how I got out. I woke up at home, in my car, parked in the garage. The engine was off and the keys were on the seat. Yesterday I tried to find that road again. It doesn't exist. The extra passenger. I work as a taxi driver in Boston. I've seen a lot of weird things, but one night still haunts me. It was around 2 a.m. when I got a pickup request from an abandoned neighborhood. I was supposed to pick someone up on Pine Grove Street. That street had always been gloomy, but I didn't think much of it. When I arrived, a woman in a gray coat was standing by the curb. I pressed the button to unlock the doors. She got into the back seat. I asked, "Where to?" She said nothing. I turned around, and she was gone. Just an empty seat. I thought maybe she got out, but the doors hadn't even opened. I floored it, trying to shake it off. But 5 minutes later, I glanced in the mirror and saw her again. She was sitting there, staring out the window. I nearly crashed into a pole. "Who are you?" I yelled. The woman slowly turned her head. Her eyes were empty, without pupils. She opened her mouth, but instead of a voice, I heard static, like a broken radio. I jumped out of the car and ran. When I came back with the police, the car was empty. But there was still an imprint on the back seat, as if someone was still sitting there. Since then, I don't take rides after midnight. The mirror mistake. My daughter Emily loves playing in front of the bathroom mirror. She makes up imaginary friends and tells them stories. One evening I was walking by and heard her quietly say, "You're not real, are you?" I peeked into the bathroom. Emily was standing in front of the mirror, smiling widely. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" I asked. "Me, Daddy," she said, waving at her reflection. But her reflection didn't wave back. It just stood there, smiling. I slowly approached the mirror, and that Emily kept smiling. Then it tilted its head in the opposite direction, differently from the real Emily. I turned off the bathroom light. As the light went out, I caught a glimpse of the reflection suddenly raising its hand and striking the glass. We took down the mirror after that. But sometimes I catch Emily staring at the blank wall, and it feels like something is staring back. The neighbor from the empty house. When I moved into a new house on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, everything seemed perfect. A quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, fresh air. The only thing that broke this idyllic picture was the old house across the street. Its windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Neighbors said the house had been empty for about 10 years, since the last owner mysteriously disappeared. But the strange thing was something else. Every night a light would turn on in the second-floor window. I noticed the faint yellowish glow flickering, as if someone was walking around with a flashlight. I thought maybe local teenagers were sneaking in, but every time I tried to get closer, the light would go out. One evening, my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and crossed the street. The house's front door was closed, but not locked. The creak of the old hinges echoed through the empty rooms. Inside, it smelled of dampness and dust. Footprints on the floor led upstairs. I climbed to the second floor and saw an old rocking chair near the window. It was slowly rocking, though there wasn't the slightest draft in the room. On the windowsill sat a cup of hot tea. Steam was still rising from it. Suddenly I felt someone standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. However, in the mirror across the room, I saw the reflection of a man in dark clothes. He was staring directly at me. But when I turned back, the room was empty. I bolted from the house, stumbling down the stairs. But when I looked back, I saw that same man standing in the window. He was watching me and slowly waving. Neighbors say I must have imagined it. But every night the light comes back on. Sometimes I feel like someone is watching me through the curtains of my own house. Time glitch. I'm just an ordinary office worker. Every morning starts the same. Wake up at 6:30, shower, coffee, and leave for work by 7:30. But one day everything went wrong. I woke up and immediately felt something was off. The light in the room was unnaturally dim, as if there was a storm outside. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, 7:30, but the kitchen clock showed 6:45, and my phone said 8:10. Confused, I assumed the battery in the clock was dying. I stepped outside and noticed the street looked strange. The trees were smaller, as if newly planted. The houses looked newer, and instead of my neighbor's pickup truck, there was an old Toyota I remembered from my childhood. People on the street stopped and stared at me as if they'd never seen me before. I turned the corner and saw something impossible. My father was sitting on a bench. He had died 10 years ago. He looked exactly as he did the day he passed. I froze, unable to move. My father lifted his head and stared straight at me. His face was serious, even angry. He raised a finger to his lips and whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." I blinked, and he was gone. Everything around me grew even darker, and suddenly I was back in my bed. The clock read 6:30. Since then, I'm afraid to look at clocks. They all show different times. Sometimes I wonder if I ever made it back to the world I left. My friend Alex was an ordinary guy. He didn't believe in anything paranormal until he got that call. It happened late at night. He got a call from an unknown number. When he answered, he heard a faint whisper, "Don't answer tomorrow." He thought it was a prank and forgot about it. But the next night the phone rang again. Same number. Alex decided not to answer. The phone rang for a long time, then stopped. But a minute later it rang again. This time, it answered on its own. The voice was clearer now. "I told you not to answer." That same night, his car crashed into a tree. The police said he must have been distracted by his phone, but they found his phone shattered in the glove compartment. The last call was recorded at 11:23 p.m. from a number that doesn't exist. When I called that number, someone answered, "Now it's your turn." Since then, I never answer calls after midnight. I often spent my summers at my grandmother's house. Her home sat right at the edge of the forest. One night, I heard a soft tapping on the window. I approached and saw two children standing there. They were barefoot on the damp ground, a girl and a boy. Their faces were unnaturally pale. "Let us in," the girl whispered. "We're cold." Something about her voice felt wrong. I ran to my grandmother. She took my hand and whispered, "Don't look them in the eyes. And don't open the door. They are not children." I was too afraid to go back to the window, but I could hear them tapping for a long time. The next morning, there were small wet footprints beneath the window, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped. Sometimes I still feel someone watching me in the dark. This happened last summer when I was driving home from work. I'm a truck driver, often covering long routes across different states. That day, I left Chicago and was heading to a small town in Indiana. The trip usually takes about 4 hours, but this time, something went wrong. My GPS suddenly suggested a new route, an hour shorter. The road led through rural areas I had never seen before. I thought maybe a new highway had been built, so I turned without a second thought. At first, everything seemed normal. A smooth road, fields, and the occasional farmhouse. But with every mile, things started to change. The road became narrower, cracks spread across the asphalt, and dense forests stretched on both sides. Then I noticed something strange. Old rusted road signs covered in moss began to appear along the roadside. One of them pointed to a town called Ashfield. I'd never heard of such a place, and Google showed no results. But I couldn't stop. The GPS went silent. No signal. The road led me to an abandoned town. Wooden houses stood crooked, windows shattered, and not a single soul on the streets. I tried to turn around, but the engine died. I got out to check, and that's when I noticed the tires were covered in a thick layer of dust, as if I'd been driving this road for weeks. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing on my chest. Then I began to hear faint whispers. Looking around, I saw people. They stood far away between the houses, like they were waiting. I tried calling out, but they didn't move. They just watched. Suddenly my phone vibrated, an unknown number. I answered, and a voice whispered, "You weren't supposed to be here. Turn back, now." I bolted to the truck, but the engine wouldn't start. The people began moving closer, slowly but steadily. I twisted the key in the ignition over and over until the engine finally roared to life. I slammed the gas and sped back the way I came. But the road was gone. The forest had closed in, and the Ashfield sign had vanished. I drove aimlessly until I finally found a familiar highway. When I stopped to catch my breath, my phone vibrated again. A text message, "You'll be back." I searched for that town on maps and forums. It doesn't exist. But I still remember the whispers and the empty eyes of the people who were waiting. I never thought much about mirrors. They're in every home, and we're used to seeing our reflection. But what if it's not just a copy? That evening, I was sitting in the living room watching TV. Off to the side stood an old mirror in a wooden frame that I had taken from my grandfather's garage. It always made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. Out of the corner of my eye, I glanced at it and noticed something odd. My reflection was sitting differently than I was. I thought it was just fatigue, but when I tilted my head, it didn't follow. I froze. The reflection smiled. I didn't. Slowly it stood up and moved closer to the glass. I couldn't move. It tilted its head and raised a finger to its lips. "Shh," it whispered. I jumped back and tore the mirror from its frame, hoping it was some kind of optical illusion. But behind the glass, there was nothing. No room, no reflection, just emptiness. Since then, I've tried to avoid mirrors, but sometimes, in windows or screens, I see it, watching, waiting. I work in an office and every day is the same, but one day started repeating. It began on a Wednesday. I woke up, had breakfast, and went to work. My coworker John spilled coffee on his shirt, and the printer broke at 2 p.m. But the next day, it all happened again and again. I thought I was losing my mind. I tried changing things. It didn't help. I skipped coffee, but John still spilled his. I unplugged the printer, but it still broke. On the 5th day, I noticed something strange. My coworker Sarah was sitting in the corner, staring at me. "You see it too," she whispered. It turned out she'd been stuck in this day for years. She had tried everything to escape, but nothing worked. We decided to stay in the office overnight, breaking the routine. That's when something terrifying happened. Men in black suits entered the office. Silently, they approached us. One of them leaned in and said, "You weren't supposed to notice." The lights went out, and I woke up in my bed. It was Wednesday again, but now I see them in the crowd, watching. Posted by you/vanished home. 2 years ago, I moved into a new house on the outskirts of the city, an old building built back in the 60s. There was something cozy about the creaky floors and old wooden windows, but something started to feel off. I first noticed it when I accidentally discovered a door to the basement. It was hidden behind an old wardrobe in the hallway that I hadn't touched since moving in. The door was locked, but not tightly. When I opened it, I saw a narrow staircase leading down. The basement was much larger than I expected. There were empty rooms resembling a child's bedroom, an office, even a kitchen, though everything looked abandoned. But the problem was the basement wasn't on the house's floor plan. The next day, I asked my neighbor about it. He looked at me like I was insane. "There's never been a basement here. You must be mistaken." I went back home, but I couldn't find the door again. The wardrobe was flush against the wall. I searched for any gap, any sign of the door, but the wall was solid. But every night, I heard footsteps, somewhere below. Posted by you/endless driver. I work as a manager and often get home late. One night changed my life. It was past midnight, and I was driving on a familiar highway. But after merging onto the interstate, I noticed I kept passing the same road signs. At first, I thought I was just tired, but after an hour, I realized I was driving in circles. I pulled over, grabbed my phone. No signal. I stepped out of the car. Everything was perfectly still. No cars, no people. When I got back in, I saw a man sitting in the back seat, motionless, staring straight ahead. His lips barely moved. "You weren't supposed to be here. Keep driving." I slammed on the gas and didn't stop. Somehow, within minutes, I was in front of my house. Since that day, I've never taken that road again. But sometimes, when I pass by reflective surfaces, I think I see that man behind me. Posted by you/no-floor elevator. I live in a high-rise building and use the elevator every day. One day it took me somewhere it shouldn't have. I pressed the button for my floor, but the elevator went below the ground level. The display showed nothing, just a black screen. The doors opened, and I stepped out. The corridor was long and dark, with old doors lining both sides. The air was cold and damp. I called out, but only my echo answered. When I turned back to the elevator, the display read, "Do not step out." I pressed every button. The doors finally closed, and the elevator began to move. It brought me back to my floor. But something was wrong. My apartment looked the same, but the photos on the walls had different people in them, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw myself, but not me. Posted by you/missing hour. It happened on a Tuesday, just a normal day. I left my apartment at 8:30 a.m., like always, to grab coffee from my favorite cafe around the corner. I clearly remember locking the door, checking my keys in my pocket, and even noticing the wet pavement from the overnight rain. The next thing I remember, I was standing in front of the cafe, staring at the time on my phone. 10:02 a.m. I froze. That was impossible. The walk there takes 5 minutes at most. I hadn't talked to anyone, hadn't stopped anywhere. The time just vanished. My head was spinning. I checked my calls, my messages. Nothing. No missed calls, no texts. Everything around me seemed normal. People rushing to work, cars honking at the intersection. But the feeling of lost time wouldn't leave me. Back home, I decided to check my pockets. I found a receipt from a store I had never been to. It had an address I didn't recognize and my signature. It said I bought 2 items, a pen and a folder. I went to that address. It was an abandoned building, burnt walls, shattered windows, no store in sight. And then I saw graffiti on the wall, in large black letters, "You've been here before." Posted by you/not seen. The strange things started small. Books on my shelf were out of order, even though I knew how I arranged them. A mug I left on the kitchen table would end up in the sink. I thought it was just forgetfulness. But every night, the feeling that someone else was in the room grew stronger. I decided to set up a camera in the living room, just to calm myself down. The next morning, I watched the footage. At 2:43 a.m., the door slowly opened, but no one came in. Gradually, a chair slid across the floor, and the newspaper on the table flipped a page. Panic set in. I installed another camera in my bedroom. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I watched the video. At first, nothing unusual, but exactly at 3:15 a.m., the camera slowly turned on its own. It stopped, pointing directly at me, sleeping. I held my breath when I saw an invisible hand glide over the blanket near my face. And then the camera turned off. Posted by you/shadow behind. While cleaning out old things in my parents' attic, I found a box of old photos. Among them was one I had never seen before. My parents and I were at the beach. I must have been about 6. I was wearing a hat and smiling at the camera. But in the background, slightly off to the side, stood a man in dark clothing. His face was blurry, but he was staring directly into the lens, right at me. I showed the photo to my mom. She was silent for a long time, then quietly said, "There was no one there. We were alone." I felt uneasy. I started flipping through more photos, and in several others, he was there too, always in the background, but always looking straight at the camera. Since that day, I started seeing him in real life, at the bus stop, in crowds, standing far away but always staring. One time I walked into a cafe, and when I looked up from my phone, he was sitting at the next table, motionless. I left immediately. I don't use public transport anymore, but sometimes in the window of the building across from mine, I see his silhouette. Posted by you Sameface. It was cold, and I was waiting for the bus. There weren't many people around. I absent-mindedly looked at the shop window across the street, and I saw myself. Like a mirror, but it wasn't a mirror. It was a guy dressed exactly like me. Same hoodie, same jeans. He even stood the same way. I stared for a long time, hoping it was just a coincidence. But then he lifted his head and smiled. He smiled first. The bus arrived, and he got on. I stayed behind. An hour later, my mom called. "Were you downtown?" "I called you, but you just walked away." "I wasn't downtown. I didn't get on that bus. But someone did." Posted by you, locked exit. Behind the door was a long concrete corridor, gloomy, damp, with faint lights flickering overhead. I walked a few meters in, and the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed back, but the door was gone, just a solid concrete wall, no seams, no handle. The corridor grew darker. Then I heard footsteps, slow, steady, echoing from deep within. I started running, but each step felt heavier. The lights began to flicker out. At the end of the corridor, I saw the same door. I yanked it open and found myself back in the office. But my co-workers stared at me like they'd seen a ghost. One of them whispered, "You disappeared 3 days ago." Posted by You Ma Vanished Store. Last Saturday, I went to a new grocery store that had opened nearby. I clearly remember the bright red logo with yellow text saying Fresh Mart. The store was spacious with tidy shelves, and calm music was playing. I bought a few items and paid with cash since the terminal wasn't working. The next day, when I told my neighbor about the store, he looked at me in surprise. There was never a Fresh Mart here, just an old abandoned building. I decided to check, and indeed where the store was supposed to be, there was a charred building with broken windows. I peered inside. It was empty. But when I got home, I found the receipt with my purchases. It had the date, time, and the Fresh Mart store. At the very bottom of the receipt, there was a phrase I hadn't seen before. "Thank you for returning." Posted by You Window Watcher. I live on the 9th floor, and there are no other tall buildings across from mine. Just a park. One evening I came home and looked out the window. In the reflection I saw someone standing behind me. I quickly turned around. No one was there, but in the mirror he was. A man in a black coat, with a faceless expression, staring at me. I no longer look out of windows after sunset, but sometimes I hear someone gently tapping on the glass. On the 9th floor. Posted by You/Missing Bus. It was late, and I was heading home on the last bus. It was almost empty, just the driver and 2 passengers. I dozed off and woke up in complete darkness. The bus was stopped in the middle of an unknown highway. The driver was gone. The other passengers were gone, too. I got off and walked down the road. No lights, no signs. Silence. I walked ahead, trying to find some kind of landmark, but after a few minutes I turned around and saw the bus. The doors were open, the light was on, and someone was sitting in my seat. Posted by You/No Such Street. This incident happened about a year ago. I'd been living in the city for several years, and I always took the same route home. The street I walked on was as familiar to me as the back of my hand. But one day, I decided to take a shortcut and turned onto a little alley that, seemingly, I had never noticed before. It was narrow, between 2 old buildings, and looked almost perfect to save a few minutes. As I began walking, the street was completely empty. No people, no cars. But I didn't feel any unease, since I live in a quiet neighborhood. The road was covered in a thin layer of snow that crunched under my feet, and I didn't pay much attention to the details. However, the further I walked, the more it seemed like the street had no end. After a few minutes, I turned around and realized I couldn't see the same turn I had just made. I started walking back, and at that moment, a feeling washed over me that I had walked into someone's trap. The street was once again endless. I started to panic, but kept moving forward. Then I saw him, a man standing far ahead at the end of the street. He looked strange, very tall, in a black coat, with a hood that obscured his face. He slowly started walking toward me. The first time he didn't stop when I greeted him and asked how to get out of this street. But when he got closer, he stopped, looked me in the eyes, and quietly said, "Don't stop. They're already here." I didn't understand his words, but I felt cold sweat prickling under my nails. I ran back sharply and finally returned to the familiar street. When I looked back, the alley was empty again, and I was never able to find that turn again. But I know for sure that man was waiting for me. Posted by You, Future Call. This happened about 2 weeks ago. I was lying in bed, waking up in the middle of the night, when I saw my phone glowing. A call, an unknown number. I was curious and picked up the receiver. On the other end was my voice. I could barely believe my ears when I heard, "Don't leave the house tomorrow." It was me, my own voice. It sounded too real, even a bit frightened. I tried to ask who it was, but the line cut off. That made me uneasy. My mind was racing with thoughts, but I decided it was just some silly prank, or maybe I had recorded myself and forgotten about it. But the next morning I stayed home. I felt like something wasn't right. Then the news reported about an accident on my route, one that would have happened if I had been there. I had to stop, and I did. But now I don't know what it was, a call from the future, or just a coincidence. I'll never understand. Posted by you, unknown photo. This happened a few weeks ago. I was scrolling through photos on my phone when I came across one I definitely didn't take. It was a picture of my room at night. I was sleeping on my bed, and everything seemed normal, but what scared me was that I didn't remember taking this photo. I started examining it closely. The shot was taken from a corner of the room where I definitely couldn't have been. The photo showed me sleeping, and on the desk there were my things. But what made me stop was that in the dark corner there was a man. His face was blurry, and his shadow was completely unclear, like it often is in night photos. I started panicking because that man was dressed exactly like me, and it seemed like he was watching me. I checked all my other photos, and there it was. Another one, taken in the same spot. This time the man was closer, and his eyes were fixed on me. What surprised me the most, the next morning I found a note on my desk that read, "You've seen this before." Posted by you, Trow Curtain Shadow. This happened when I was a child. I had a large room with windows facing the backyard, and I was always afraid of the curtains. Although I tried many times to find a logical explanation for this fear, I never could. The views of dark figures behind the curtain, which I'd often see during evening walks in the yard, always terrified me. One evening, when I was about 10 years old, I saw the shadow moving behind the curtains again. The shadow was too large to be just a tree or animals passing by. I could hear it getting closer, and I froze in place. Instead of getting up and going to check, I kept watching. The shadow was moving closer, like a human figure, and I realized it couldn't just be some other shadow from the outside world. I felt something warm and heavy on my bed. When I turned around, there was no one in my room. I looked back at my pillow, where there was a deep indentation, as if someone had just been lying in my spot. Posted by you/offscreen. This incident happened recently. I was sitting on the couch when I turned off the TV after watching the evening news. I switched it off, using the remote, and placed the remote on the table to avoid any distractions. A few minutes later, I noticed something strange. On the black screen of the TV, my reflection appeared. I was surprised, as the TV was off. However, the image of me was clear and lifelike. It was definitely me, but something was off. My figure was different. I raised my hand, and my reflection did the same, but with a slight delay. Then it raised its eyebrows, as if encouraging me to do something. A chill ran down my spine. I tried turning the TV off again, but it didn't respond. My reflection began smiling. Now, I avoid looking at screens when they're off. Posted by you, Hall Mirror. I recently realized that all hotels have one thing in common: a large mirror in the hallway. I don't know why, but it's strange. One time, I noticed a mirror in the hallway of an old hotel when I was coming back from dinner. It struck me as odd that the mirror looked old, with scratches and smudges. I looked at myself, but immediately felt something strange. My reflection wasn't moving in sync with me. It was as if it was lagging, and then suddenly started moving in time with me. In my reflection, I saw my eyes start to look not at the mirror, but directly at me. Horrified, I realized that the reflection started smiling. Its smile was so unsettling, I could hardly look away. It didn't stop smiling until I stepped away from the mirror. Posted by You Whisperwall. This happened at night. I had just fallen asleep when I suddenly heard a strange voice. At first it was just faint sounds, like whispers, coming through the wall. I tried to ignore it, but the voices got louder. I got up and knocked on the wall, but it didn't help. When I returned to bed, I distinctly heard someone quietly whisper, "I know you can hear me." I immediately felt coldness flood my body. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the voice didn't stop. It kept going. "You're not alone." I ran out of the apartment, and believe me, the voices didn't stop until I left the building.